Okay, I think let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Martha Shields. I'm the director of the New England Environmental Finance Center. The New England Environmental Finance Center is one of 10 university-based EFCs, that's how we call it in the country. The EFCs work in each of the 10 EPA regions in the United States with the shared goal to build community and tribal capacity to sustainably pay for the increasing cost of environmental programs and climate resilience actions. The SNEP network is a collaboration of local technical assistance providers in the Southeast New England area, which is Rhode Island and Massachusetts. You might be able to make that out in the map in the slide. That project, the SNEP network, is managed and led by the New England EFC, and we are really grateful to EPA Region 1 for funding our cooperative agreement for the SNEP network in order to deliver trainings like this one and to give direct technical assistance to the SNEP communities. Next slide, please. Some of our partners in the SNEP network, next slide, please. Thank you. Some of our, back one slide. Great. That's the agenda. Some of our partners in the SNEP network are leading today's webinar. I'm just going to go quickly through the agenda. First, we will hear from Chris Dotson. He is the director of our sister center at the Environmental Finance Center at Syracuse University. He will be presenting on the process of crafting a competitive proposal, some lessons learned, and common mistakes to avoid. Then we will hear from the another SNEP network partner, Joanne Throwe of Throwe Environmental, and her colleague, Kyle, about the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund. Joanne and Kyle will explain how communities can prepare themselves for that opportunity, as well as other federal funding sources. Then there will be time to ask the experts questions in a Q&A session and a brief wrap up and final thoughts from my colleague, Joanne. Next slide, please. Great. Some logistics. We will be recording this webinar and you will be receiving all the PowerPoint presentations you'll see through this webinar from us shortly, right after, probably in a day or two. Please keep your microphone muted, and we are going to use the chat button for questions. You can report any technical issues that you have through the chat. Next slide, please. I'm sure everyone's a Zoom expert by now, but this is a guide on how to keep yourself muted, and also how to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. But before I turn it over to Chris, I want to add something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, that this country is in a very unique and unprecedented period of opportunity for communities of all sizes to take advantage of the large federal stimulus monies that are being released very shortly in the next 4 to 6 months. Those communities that can effectively describe their past planning efforts and all the work that they've put into their plans and what they hope to achieve with new funds, they will be in a really good position, but only if they can craft a well-written proposal that is geared to the suitable funding sources. They'll be in a great position to tap into those large funding opportunities. And that's what today's webinar is all about. I also want to encourage you to work with your state's many technical assistance providers. We have people from all over the country on this webinar, mostly from the Northeast, but I know we have people from, I think there's somebody from Montana even. But I want to encourage you to work with your state's technical assistance providers, because they are the experts that are there to help communities, including with helping you review, and some can even prepare proposals for you. So please take advantage of that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Dotson.
Thanks, Martha. So my portion of this presentation today is really to talk about kind of the basics of writing grants. I think grant writing often causes a lot of anxiety for folks because it's like the fear of the unknown. A lot of people have maybe some insecurities about their writing style or ability. It sounds like a very daunting process. It's often not that hard to write a grant, especially these days with everything being essentially submitted electronically. It's like filling out a form or a survey. I'm going to mute my video because it looks like it might be better off that way. So in any case, I'm just going to go through some of the grant basics, and then I'll pass it off to our friends at Throwe Environmental to talk a little more specifically about some of the funding programs that I'll cover a couple, and then they will. You probably recognize this guy, especially if you're of a certain age, who would try to sell his guidebooks for free money, free government money, back in the 80s and 90s. There's no such thing as free money, right? I mean, taking the time to write a grant application, time is money. Your staff time, your salary is money, right? But also administering that grant is also quite a heavy lift, particularly with the state and federal grant programs. It's not arduous. It's just there's more work to do than just actually constructing or implementing your proposed project. So you have to be mindful of that administrative force, if you will, that goes behind administering any awarded grants. So you want to think about, you know, what's more painful or what's easier, looking for alternative sources of revenue to fund your project, or writing and administering a grant. And it depends on the project, right? And so some things may necessitate external funding, some may not. And there may also not be the appropriate funding sources out there for some of your projects. And you're gonna wanna know that too. And then, is your project a priority, both for yourself and for the funding source? You may find that some funding sources are often highly competitive, and may not have enough money to fund your project. And so they look at what their priorities are, and they try to rank these applications, no matter how good your application is or how laudable your proposed project is. It just may not reach that funding, the level of funding. And then for yourself and your community, you want to look at, you know, how would your project fit into the big picture, your master plan, your comprehensive plan, plans for the future in your community. So where to start? So even if you have an idea for a project, you're going to want to see what else is out there, who's doing what. And I say that because there tends to be trends in technology, in the things that get funded. I'll give you a very brief example. In New York State, a few years ago, it snows in New York, for those of you who don't know. And a lot of municipalities historically have kept their salt, not everybody, but many kept their winter salt not covered, right? And so when it rains, that salt kind of dissolves and runs off into our freshwater streams, which is not a good thing. And so a few years ago, New York State legislated that all salt piles had to be covered within a certain number of feet from streams. And then they created a funding mechanism for communities to build those salt barns. So we saw 2 or 3 years of just salt barn funding, right, through the water programs, and since then that's kind of dissipated. But you want to look at what people are doing, what regulations are out there, what funding sources are being prioritized to implement certain types of projects, because it'll help inform if, when, and where you submit that project idea. Have a brainstorm session with other people. You know, chatting with folks, you generally come up with better ideas when working together on thoughts, and put those thoughts down on paper. You don't want to forget them, even the ones that may not stick right away. You might end up circling back to them after further discussion. Always have goals. What is the goal for your project, right? and you want to be able to state those in your application. So what's the goal of the salt barn? To protect the freshwater habitat for brook trout and other things, right? Also not to waste the resource of salt dissolving and running away. Establishing timelines, you want to give the funding agency some assurances that you've thought about how long this project's going to take realistically, from soup to nuts, from design to bidding to pre-construction, construction, and then the finalizing. You also want to make sure you're estimating for costs for staff, materials, and equipment. And you want to plan for an evaluation of success. Success is just not, we built this salt barn, or we rehabbed the clarifier tank on our wastewater treatment plant. Yes, that is success, but success is also on time and under budget, right? You want to be able to think a little more thoroughly about what success is, and having an operation and management plan for that thing once you've developed it. And that's my last bullet is, once you build it, how are you going to pay for its maintenance, continued maintenance, and upkeep? When you buy a car, you don't just think about how much that car costs, right? You think about the insurance, the oil changes, the gas, et cetera, et cetera. So once you think you've identified a grant source, you want to look at a few quick questions, right? Are you eligible as a municipality, as a utility, an agency, authority, whatever entity you are you eligible for this funding program? Not all folks are eligible for every funding program. Is there a requirement to match or cost share? And if so, can you do that? Often you can cost share your staff's time to administer the grant or to work with the contractor or the consulting engineer or whoever you have essentially implementing your project for you. You can cost share your time, you can cost share your equipment, hours, etc. It's also nice to see how many projects are funded. If your project is going to cost $100,000 and they have $1 million total, that means they're going to fund 10 projects. And, how competitive is it? Are you going to be able to get a piece of that pie, so to speak? And then, can you meet all of the requirements? There's often minority and women business participation in projects that's required. There's American Steel and other requirements on labor and labor costs that are required of certain grant programs. And you're going to want to make sure you can meet those requirements, meet and or exceed them. And then the type of project, some funding programs will fund planning, some will fund construction, some will fund both. And so you want to and some will fund like rehab and repair or replacement, but not expansion of infrastructure. So you want to make sure that your project fits the needs of that grant program. And also it's kind of, you want to consider the geographic spread of where these grants go. And what I mean by that is, if we're taking New York as an example, or Rhode Island, right? They're not going to, if they have 5 projects, they're not all going to be in and around Providence. They're going to look for the best projects that meet the needs of the whole state. So you may see that they're going to be spread out around. So here where I sit in Syracuse, if I know that there's a municipality adjacent to me that's applying for the same project, I might consider trying to either wait or work with that municipality and see if you can do, an IMA, an intermunicipal agreement, and apply together if your needs are similar enough and if it makes sense. Because for both of you to be funded in the same year, it might be unlikely. And again, that depends on the availability of funds and the need around your state. So some reasons why proposals fail: you don't meet the guidelines, you're not on time. Some of the ones I think that are more important to consider is you weren't able to adequately demonstrate your need for the funding or the need for the project. You weren't able to show that you actually have the capacity, the administrative force, the time to manage the project. You didn't really think through how you're going to implement the project, or you didn't clearly articulate that in your application, an unrealistic budget, and your cost is greater than the benefit, right? So no one is going to be getting $1 million to build a salt barn for, 5 tons of salt. It's just not worth it. Or overbuilding a water treatment plant for a community that is not growing. So some things to think about. But the upshot is, if your proposal is rejected, almost every agency will offer you an opportunity to get feedback from them, either written or through a phone call conversation. You take that feedback, you improve your application, and you reapply. And the chances of success on the second time is 1 in 5. And then if you fail again, it may again not be because your project's not worthy, but because they don't have enough funding to reach you, right? And so then you get that feedback and you apply again, and then it's all the rate of success is almost 1-to-1 on that third application or that third submission. If you take anything away from this, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is call the program officer. There's always a contact person. They have their email and phone number. Call them, talk to them, let them know what your project is, and listen to what they have to say. And do that before you apply, because they'll give you some advice that's worth its weight in gold. I'm not going to spend too much time here. You can look at these bullets yourself, but you're having good writing style and editing and evidence and data really strengthens your proposal, right? Having poor writing, having opinion or anecdotal evidence with nothing to back it up really destroys your credibility and really makes people suspect of whether or not your project is worthy of funding. And so you want to make sure you're not only using good grammar, good editing, but that you're backing up everything that you put in your application with data, with information. You want to be as descriptive with your language as possible. So I've gotten so much feedback from so many state agencies who say we get applications that are titled the same title as our funding program. That's ridiculous, right? So you want to give them information that they don't already know. And so this example here, the no, right? So this application was from the local waterfront revitalization program. That's the name of the grant program. So this title tells the reviewer nothing, right? We already know you're applying to this grant application, and we already know you're the Village of Littleville. So if you look at a title that actually says something, creating a Creekside Live, Work, Play district in downtown Littleville, that actually is more interesting and attractive language, but it also provides more information to the reviewer that they don't already know. And then all through your application, wherever you can use words that paint a picture, that tell a story. So rain barrel installation on school grounds. Okay, you told us what you're going to do in very basic words. It's not exciting. There's no action there, but you could call it something slightly different. Teaching students about stormwater management through experiential hands-on learning. There's more words there, but there's a lot more description as well. And this is the type of things that allow reviewers to understand what it is you're proposing. So after you've put everything together, you want to just set it aside for a couple days, get some fresh eyes, have someone else read it, have them tell you what they think the project is about. Sometimes the words that are in your head are not the words that are on the page. So my last couple slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few funding programs, and then I'll pass it on to Joanne and Kyle. This is a funny image. I try to include funny images. Little side story. They had this at a birthday party at the Chuck E. Cheese once, and all the little kids at the Chuck E. Cheese were terrified of this type of machine. And so I just thought it was kind of ironic that adults find it so fun and kids are terrified. So here's a list of a few funding programs that you may or may not already know of. And I'll go through this list. I'm going to go through the first three here on this list, and then Joanne and Kyle will follow up with number 4 and 5. So I'm going to touch on these really briefly. If you want more detail on these funding programs, drop it in the chat. We may not have time to answer all the questions at the end of this webinar, but we'll be able to certainly follow up with you on a one-on-one basis later if you request more detail on any of these funding programs or on the eligibility of a project you may have in mind. So USDA Rural Development, really through the Rural Utility Services, they fund water, wastewater, and stormwater projects for communities with a population of 10,000 or less. And they often will co-fund, which means look for opportunities to spread the resources around with other programs like CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, through your state agencies, and also through your state agencies with the Clean Water and the Drinking Water SRF. So when you, particularly with water, wastewater, stormwater projects, and a number of these projects, and I'll show you in a minute, really do fall within the guise of resiliency. When you're developing these types of projects, don't get anxious about the funding caps for these programs, because you may find that you are not going to be funded by just one funding program, but maybe 2 or 3. All right, so focusing a little bit on the American Recovery Act that came out because of the infrastructure bill and coming out of the pandemic, because the SRFs will be one of the major avenues for getting that funding out the door and to communities that request those funds. And part of that is because the SRFs have been around for so long. It's an existing process that can get this money moving quickly. So looking at ARPA and what they're proposing, and now remember, there is no final rule yet. They're still negotiating the infrastructure bill in Congress. But what they're proposing at this point is that the Clean Water SRF, so that's for wastewater, would include these types of projects. So construct, improve, and repair treatment plants. Some of the stuff is just, carryover from existing SRF eligibilities, but there's some new stuff in here as well related to pollution, severe weather events, and resilience. And then below is the drinking water SRF. So a couple of new things there. You might notice replacing lead service lines, which hasn't been there previously. Now, outside of those lists, there are other types of things that the Treasury, through their guidance to Congress, is recommending they use the SRFs for. Cybersecurity, a lot more green infrastructure to improve resilience to climate change, and projects that assist people most in need. So we're looking at affordability for water and wastewater. And I don't know why it formatted this way, but then they did also outline some ineligible projects. So they're not looking to expand systems with this money. If it's a stormwater project, it should address quality, not quantity. The stormwater should address quantity, not just quality. And then they're also not funding construction or rehab of dams. So just a couple other things. Again, you're not just buying the car, you're also buying the cost of maintaining it. So when we're doing these projects, you have to think about how to keep it financially sustainable moving forward. It may mean you have to raise rates on users. You shouldn't expect that there will be more external funding coming in the future. My one example of working with adjacent municipalities, there might be cost avoidance in shared services that you might want to explore. And there are funding programs out there that would help you investigate those opportunities. And then I just wanted to point out this little chart here. Oops. Uh, federal funding for water and wastewater really peaked in the late 70s, early 80s, largely because of the Clean Water Act. And then during the Reagan administration, the construction grants went away. And then the SRFs became the main vehicle for loans for water and wastewater primarily. But that funding has continued to decrease, largely because many of these plants were built because of the Clean Water Act. So you would imagine that their lifespan, is several decades. But we're at a point now where many of these plants need that rehab. And so hopefully this Infrastructure Act will help many of our communities take a look at this infrastructure, particularly in the face of climate change. So I am going to stop there. This is my information, and then I think I'm going to kick it off to Joanne. I'll stop sharing my screen and she can pick up.
Actually, we're going to turn it to Kyle first.
Oh, great.
Perfect. Thank you both. So I will pull up my screen. We should be able to see these and I can get us going. So what Joanne and I will do with this next portion of the presentation is take what Chris just described as some of those key lessons learned, kind of do's and don'ts and funding tips, and we'll apply those to a couple of different funding programs. Specifically, we'll focus on the National Coastal Resilience Fund. We'll also do a bit of a deep dive into the BRIC program, as well as quickly covering a few others. So just kind of a lay of the land and where we're going here. So I'll touch on BRIC first. I'll highlight a few of those other programs that we just want to flag for everyone's attention. We'll give a good conversation to the NCRF that's put on by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We'll compare BRIC and the NCRF, and then we'll wrap up with a few slides on funding versus more sustainable financing options. So to start with, we've got FEMA's BRIC program, and that stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. So at its core, BRIC really supports awardees as they undertake projects that reduce risk to natural hazards and disasters before those disasters will strike. So in other words, BRIC is funding mitigation and resilience, not necessarily disaster response. And then, as you might guess by the name of the program, it's very infrastructure focused. So that means it typically favors on-the-ground resilience and mitigation projects, although there is some room within BRIC to cover projects that consist of capacity building or management activities. So that's something to note. Of course, with any funding program, as Chris just emphasized, we have to consider what your priorities are and what the priorities of the program itself are, and how all of that aligns. So again, BRIC is very infrastructure focused, and projects become very competitive in BRIC when they start to really pull in those other priorities when we think about infrastructure. So for example, if you have an infrastructure project that includes nature-based solutions, or that really makes the connection with community lifelines like food and water, shelter, things like that, those projects tend to become more competitive, and by nature will just at least do a little bit more well in that application process. BRIC also prioritizes projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. And we can kind of see this in its priorities as well as in the match requirements, which I'll touch on in a little bit. But communities that fall under the category of being economically disadvantaged rural communities, or what BRIC calls ERDCs, there's definitely a priority to fund projects in these areas. And those will consist of small rural communities that have a per capita annual income that's about 80% less than the national average. And then finally, I'll just touch on one more priority with BRIC for this fiscal year, and that is the climate resilience and adaptation priority. Knowing all of the climate impacts that have already started to happen and the increasing climate impacts moving forward, this program is definitely responding to those. And you'll see that in the changes to fiscal year 21, where climate resilience tends to rise up as a priority. When we think about the funds that are offered this fiscal year, it's pretty significant. We've got $1 billion total available in fiscal year 21, as stated in the notice of funding. So that period of application will open at the end of the month on September 30th, and it won't close until January 28th of 2022. So there's some time to get in there and apply. And that $1 billion of funding will be split up into the 3 different kind of funding buckets that you see in this bottom left corner. So we've got the state and territory allocation, which will award up to $1 million per applicant. And a really easy way to kind of think about that is the fact that we have the 50 states, we've got 5 or so major territories, and then we have the District of Columbia. So all of those with about $1 million each rounds out that $56 million funding pool. Then we have a very similar situation with this tribal set aside. So again, we've got $1 million max per applicant that's available to all federally recognized tribes, and that's in its own funding pool. And then finally, the remainder of these funds are all kind of lumped together in this really massive national competition that's this year is $919 million. So that's open to all applicants, and there's a maximum request of $50 million there. So that's something to note. But it's really critical to understand who is an applicant and who is not here, especially when we're thinking about the national competition, right? With so many funds available, it's important to know upfront who is even eligible to apply for that national competition. So eligible applicants will include the states, territories, Washington, D.C., and federally recognized tribes. So those parties can directly apply to the national competition. On the other hand, sub-applicants include parties like municipalities, non-federally recognized tribes or tribal agencies, state agencies, and then private homeowners and businesses, as well as nonprofits. So all of those groups that fall into the sub-applicant bucket, they can still be considered for BRIC funding, but they have to go through the full applicants in order to do that. So in other words, if you're in the state of Rhode Island, you can have nonprofits, you can have all of the cities and towns come in, you can have private homeowners, but they all have to apply through the state of Rhode Island in order to be considered for BRIC funding. And in the national competition, you can have an unlimited number of sub-applicants come in, but they all have to be bundled together under one application coming from that state or that territory or whatever it may be. So very important to note there, and I'll touch on that again in just a moment. But a few other requirements to think about. It's important to note that the BRIC program requires that all applicants and sub-applicants have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan, and that they've also received a major disaster declaration within the last 7 years. So most, if not all, applicants tend to fit both of these criteria. So that's good knowing ahead of time, but something to think about moving forward, as this program is annual. And then when we think about match for BRIC, there is a cost share required for all sub-applicants. The match or the cost share can consist of cash, donations, in-kind services, materials, or any combination thereof. But generally, it's a 75 to 25 federal, non-federal cost share. Now, BRIC does offer a little bit of I guess you could call it a discounted rate for those economically disadvantaged rural communities. And that split becomes 90% federal to 10% non-federal. So something to note, and again, that just aligns back with that priority of investing in disadvantaged communities. And then really kind of tying this all together with the first half of the presentation that we heard from Chris, we've got some key tips just based on what we've seen with this funding program that we really think will help make for more competitive proposals. So first off, we found it really critical to be communicating with your state's hazard mitigation officer. And that's evident just based on kind of the layers of eligibility and the requirements that are a part of this program. So thinking about all of that, staying in constant communication with your state or your territory's hazard mitigation officer only puts you at an advantage. And then when we're thinking about those resilience goals that you should be hitting on when you're putting together your proposals for a project in this program, it's critical that those are clearly stated, right? And that has to come across for the reviewers when they're reading your application. And if there are impacts to certain community lifelines, if you're enhancing the security of a food network or enhancing shelters, whatever that may be, all of those impacts to community lifelines should be front and center in your application. We also saw that incorporating nature-based solutions and any of the other priorities that aren't necessarily required by BRIC, but are definitely favored, any of that tends to make a proposal more competitive. And that's just one example of how you might tailor a proposal to the current year notice of funding. So for fiscal year 21, climate change, and adaptation tend to be, really prominent in this year's NOFO, but that could change by next year. There could be other priorities that come out. So thinking about how you might adapt an application to each year's notice of funding is important. We also see in this program that it's important to optimize cost effectiveness and match. And one way to do that is by bringing in different partners. So whether that's multiple different departments in one community, or whether that's engaging other communities in your area, right? So we heard Chris mention earlier, if two projects or two communities right near each other are doing two very similar projects, it's more unlikely that those two will not both get funded. So creating some sort of partnership between those groups or outside organizations just tends to make an application stronger. And then quickly before we go to the NCRF funding program, which will take up the majority of our presentation, I do just want to highlight two other programs. We won't go in depth on these, but two that we wanted to flag for you all. And if there's interest in following up on these, we definitely encourage you to do so. So first off, we've got the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, and that's put on by EPA. The current round of funding is closed right now. It actually just closed recently, but there were $7.3 million available for around 100 small one-year community projects. And the maximum award there was $75,000. So this is a smaller program. It's tailored towards smaller communities, smaller projects, small nonprofits. But there's still some real opportunity here, especially thinking about where there might be emphasis on certain priorities moving forward. So we know that this project serves underserved communities. This program operates to provide funds there, but we can think about the other priorities that it might align with: COVID-19, climate resilience, and overall issues of pollution. So the program itself works to engage and educate and empower communities to better understand and address their environmental and public health issues. So this is just one that we wanted to bring up. And it's especially useful in communities that have environmental justice populations or for organizations that serve environmental justice populations. We included the definition of EJ on the right of this slide, so you can take a peek at that. And we also encourage the use of EPA's EJ Screen resource to help kind of pinpoint those EJ communities and to think about citing projects there or working with those communities to develop projects. And then one more program that I will just touch on briefly before I pass it over to Joanne is the Long Island Sound's Futures Fund. So this program is carried out by NFWF, as is the NCRF. And for fiscal year 21, there was about $5 million available for a number of different projects. This program will cover habitat restoration and resilience, things like water quality, education, nitrogen prevention. But it's important to note here when we talk about eligibility that these different project types kind of coincide with different areas of the watershed. So if you're in the coastal Long Island Sound watershed, habitat restoration and resilience projects are something that you're eligible for. On the flip side of that, though, the further up you go to the watershed, there are certain restrictions on which projects are eligible for funding. So that will be something to note if there's interest in looking into that further. And if there is that interest, we'd be happy to follow up on that after today's presentation. So with that, I will pass it to Joanne for a bit, and she will chat with you all about NFWF's National Coastal Resilience Fund.
Thanks, Kyle. And I want to thank the New England Environmental Finance Center for hosting this, along with our partners at Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. You know, everyone is on here for different reasons. You're attending this webinar, giving us time in the afternoon, maybe because you have not been successful before at getting grants, or that you really want to be better organized to take advantage of what funding might be available, you know, if we pass a budget. But talk about climate resilience and looking at the opportunities here to make your community more resilient. So we've really honed in on a couple themes here, if you will. We're giving you, you know, so many tips to use to think through how you're going to formulate projects that you need and apply for funding. And, you know, we want to drive home a couple points. And one is there is no one size fits all project that you can just move from grant fund to grant fund. Think through. I encourage everybody to really think through what your needs are as a community. And so as you think about the impacts of climate change, we want to focus here on a wonderful opportunity. So we don't have enough time to go through this in too much detail. We encourage you to go to NFWF's website. NFWF is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, pardon for the acronym, and it's the National Coastal Resilience Fund. And I'm going to have Kyle, so we're not switching back and forth, advance our slides. So go ahead, Kyle. We're going to take some of the tips that were given to us by Chris and then Kyle and apply them to this particular fund. So this fund you're probably not aware of, very well may not have applied before. It's fairly new. They've been administering this fund since 2018, and it's a partnership. It's not just NOAA funds, but Department of Defense, EPA, AT&T, TransRe. We've got Shell, Occidental. These partners are all coming together, and this fund is right now, it has been at this past year, 32 million. But it has the potential to grow, certainly, who knows, with the infrastructure bill. And we're paying attention to this because of a few reasons. One is, it offers everything within the pipeline that you may need to become resilient. Now we're looking at coastal communities here for this one, but it does leverage public-private partnerships for conservation outcomes and really looking to invest in resilience along with that fish and wildlife benefit. So next. So where you're coming in from different parts of New England and elsewhere. So what is this? We're going to call it NCRF, National Coastal Resilience Fund footprint. So all U.S. coastal states are included to apply, and that includes the Great Lakes and territories. And if you're a coastal HUC 8 watershed that drains to the ocean or the Great Lakes, you certainly are encouraged to apply, and also adjacent HUC 8 that are low-lying or tidally influenced. So you see this map. If you see up at the top left-hand corner, a little search button, you can certainly put in your community to see if you fall within the footprint. And we encourage you to go to NFWF's website and use this tool. Next. So who's eligible? Well, this is an interesting one in that you'll see the typical eligibility applies with state and tribal, certainly, but you have municipal governments, you have nonprofits, educational institutions, of course, but also commercial organizations. Not often do you find that, but this one also can include semi-federal organizations and federal partnerships, certainly. So we're, the normal ineligible applications, such as federal agencies or employees of federal agencies or foreign organizations, foreign public entities or unincorporated individuals, which really does not apply to people on this, I don't think, who signed up for this webinar. Next. So what does it cover? So NCRF has been created to pretty much cover everything within the pipeline you may need, starting from the community capacity building and planning stage. So some of you, let's say you're from Massachusetts and you're you have a municipal vulnerability plan, or Rhode Island and you have the municipal resilience plan. Wonderful, these are great. You've started to organize, but many communities have not been able to get this yet, or you need another aspect of this. This is a good place to start. If your community does not have some type of resilience plan, here is a good one. We also have site assessment and preliminary design. We have final design and permitting, and restoration and monitoring. So every aspect, building a pipeline. So the planning level grants start and then work through the project level grants. What we encourage, though, is to pick one priority. one area. Don't try to go between categories. Stick to one, what works for you. Of course, look at the pipeline. It's intended to prepare you for that next stage. And what we're looking for, and I'll explain why I say we in a second, but what NFWF is looking for is advancing community resilience, of course, and the "and" is important here, fish and wildlife benefits. So what we're focusing here on are nature-based solutions. Kyle talked about the brick and moving towards looking at nature-based solutions. This is something you should consider this grant program if that is the direction your community wants to move. Next. So let's go through this in a little more detail. So what does, if we were to apply for this community capacity building and planning grant, what would that look like? Well, you've got potentially 2 years. What I like about this particular fund is they're not a set limit that cannot exceed. There's roughly an average application amount, but it does not cut you off. So, the bigger your community is, the needs might be bigger in terms of your grant request. They're looking for a comprehensive plan here. Of course, key components, stakeholder engagement. This is about capacity building, which you don't often see in grants. So this is a very unique opportunity to build resilience projects and really try to move towards that nature-based features for your community. Next, Kyle. Then the next one, site assessment and preliminary design. So about average, give or take about a year. At the end of this, we're looking for a design about 30 to 60% and having a go or no-go decision. And we want to know that the sites are there. So looking at key components of this, projects are prioritized in previous plans. So if NFWF would want to see that somewhere there's some resilience plan that has been identified, if not through a previous funding category from before, or just in your community. So you have identified this in some plan. You are focusing on a specific assessment. You've had conversations with permitters. Doesn't mean all the permitters have to be, set and in place on this level, but it means you're starting conversations here. And you can include baseline monitoring. So if I were to pause on this one, and don't move on this one, Kyle, yet, but let me just add a couple comments. If you think about and the people who are on this webinar who are grant reviewers and have been doing this for a while, they might be applauding me in the background, but I'm going to tee up some questions here. So if I were to look at this and I see a proposal, there's some things I'd want to see, right? I'd want to know, are you engaging the community? On every one of these categories, you should be to some extent, having a well-developed communications plan and an engagement plan with your community. And are you assessing alternatives for restoration and protection activities? Are you gathering baseline data? Are you planning to have conversations with those permitters like I mentioned? Has your project been prioritized for risk reduction and increased resilience benefits? Things like, are you offering examples of natural nature-based solutions that you anticipate using? Have you thought of any of those yet? Will the project result in a preliminary design that will allow communities to, make that go or no-go decisions? Very important that you get there in this category. We want to see that. Have you been able to support the habitat or fish and wildlife, or making sure that it's a community resilience project as well, both of them? Is your project transferring lessons? Is this transferability? Does it rank high on that? And do you have that communications plan I mentioned? And of course, what Chris and Kyle also mentioned was that partnerships. Boy, you can't say enough about partnerships. And is it large enough in that geographic area to really be worth considering? Or is it just a small pilot project, which are probably, they're important, but maybe you want to be more competitive with a, something that is a larger geographic region. And of course, cost effectiveness. Chris mentioned this, your budget, right? Thinking through, funders know very well on average what things are essentially going to cost, give or take. And they want you to do your work. They want you to think through what that budget really should look like and is it cost effective when they're reviewing it. So Chris mentioned match, right? And the match, is often difficult for communities. I know that's going to be some of the questions we hear here, but match can be found. You can try to think through, are there volunteers, that could be added to your project? Are you engaging those stakeholders and using their time wisely that you can use that? And think about long-term sustainability and past success. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to pause on that and give some key points, what things that you should think about when applying for any of these categories, really, but good pointers for all grant applications. So next, Kyle. So here we have the final design and permitting, very exciting stage. Average length is about 1.5 years. Looking for that 90 to 100% permitting. Conversations are going on, they're already underway, and we have some components of this stage, which are position projects that are ready for implementation. Restoration projects are, almost ready to go here, and the readiness for permitting. So you can include baseline monitoring in this one. Next. Then the last stage, this is a large category, a large funding amount, typically restoration and monitoring, give or take 3 years, and they want to see a year of monitoring in there. And this is where you're looking for implementation and that monitoring to occur. And you're prioritize those projects in previous planning activities. You have done your assessment and your designs, and you have a clear understanding of those permitting requirements. So now, and then next, Kyle, I wanted to explain why we are sharing this. And here's the wonderful opportunity. We at Throwe Environmental are proud to be not only a SNEP network partner helping communities in the Southeast region as part of the network, but we are also serving as field liaisons for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So it is our job within the United States to work with communities to help promote climate resilience and this program. We look to offer feedback on proposals. We really try to give that, more of a white glove approach by helping to develop stronger projects. We have at Throwe Environmental, our expertise is in climate resilience planning and financing. So we bring our expertise to the table here and really support not just existing grantees, but those who might need troubleshooting. And so next slide. What I wanted to do is share just, I've given you a couple basic tips on what makes, applying for your proposal more competitive. But let me just point a few things out. So even though this seems like a lot of money, $30+ million, or even the BRIC, some of these tips apply for the BRIC as well and the EPA grants, but competitive proposals really should clearly articulate those benefits to the community, that resilience and the fish and wildlife and habitat connection. Just don't vaguely mention it, really get to the specific information. How will it impact fish and wildlife and the community? So what are those nature-based solutions? What are they being planned? And I think about the implementation of that. Give thoughts to metrics. Sometimes you look at proposals and it's just not well thought out. And again, I mentioned match, look at cost effectiveness. Don't just try to take a project that might be in your community and try to plug it into a grant that never seems to work. Think through, think in advance, give yourself enough time to really put the right proposal together, the right project, the right site. Look to make sure it's well written. And Chris said, put it aside for a little bit, a day or two. Hey, ask your colleagues to proof it and add comments. Be welcome to that. Go back to the RFP on any of these proposals. Are you making it easy on the reader, the reviewer of your grant? Don't try to second guess what they might think. Just be very clear and specific. And then apply your projects, specifically to the goals and vision of any program, especially, if you're applying to this wonderful program. Next. And then a few more tips and we'll wrap it up. So competitive proposals really look for that partnership. Funders know if you're just adding some names in there and you really haven't engaged the community. And Chris mentioned, talk to the program officer, ask questions, let them know what you're planning well in advance. Does it make sense? Welcome that feedback. And try to, as I said, fit into one of these categories. Don't try to cover them all. Make sure it's adaptable. All of the funders, NFWF is extremely adaptable and understands that things come up, certainly, as does EPA and other funders. But, just try to work with what you can, try to move it forward in a timely manner, your project. And then, of course, look at the impacts, look at the transferability to the community and the ecosystem, and add in innovation. Innovation always has, some plugs to it that could be very beneficial to the community. So I'm making that connection for you. Next. So Kyle, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Perfect. So I will take over here, just take a couple more minutes to wrap up. And then we will go right into Q&A. So I won't go through this slide in super detail since there's a lot going on here, but I would encourage everyone, if you like what you see here, feel free to take a screenshot. You'll be getting this recording and all of these PowerPoint presentations anyway. But essentially what we have is a flow chart to direct you based on what we've seen working with the NCRF and doing our research on BRIC towards what we hope to be the more appropriate program for you. So essentially, we've just got some yes or no questions here asking if your project is focused on resilience, if it's on the ground, or if it's capacity building, and then what's the connection to nature-based solutions and fish and wildlife. So, after answering those questions and following your way along here, you should end up at what is ideally the more appropriate funding opportunity. Now, this is definitely not a silver bullet here. It won't work for everyone, but hopefully it just points you in the right direction. And then the last topic that we want to cover quickly with our presentation today is this idea of funding versus financing. So everything that we've talked about so far has been focused on grant funding opportunities, right? So kind of one-time funding versus more sustainable long-term financing opportunities. So we know that one of the reasons that communities go after grant funding is because they tend to face kind of recurring funding and capacity issues, right? And so often these resilience projects are funded out of dedicated financing mechanisms. Those systems of financing tend to be more reliable and they give the community more control. The community has a control over their priorities, what they're funding, and they kind of set the priority for what resilience will look like in your individual town. And it also allows communities to take on significant climate investments, since we know, the large scale cost of those climate investments themselves. One example of financing that many people tend to be familiar with is the stormwater utility. And now this isn't necessarily a one size fit all. This won't work for every community, but it is a good example here to kind of drive home some key points. So we know that, as Chris said earlier, grants fund implementation, but they often don't fund operations and maintenance. And if you were getting a car, you're not going to avoid getting tires or an oil change. Those are things you have to think about. So with a long-term and sustainable financing system, you get that recurring funding mechanism that comes in and it provides funds and puts them in kind of a stable place so that they can be invested. They can be used for maintenance, they can be used for match or for new capital projects on the ground. But the key point here is that they're no longer competing with the town's general funds. And we know that there are so many other priorities that go into the general fund. So something to note. And the big question then is how to make funding and financing work for you, right? How to make both work. A financing system should reflect the community's needs. It should not be one size fit all. Just like I mentioned, a stormwater utility won't work for every town, especially those where stormwater may not be the biggest problem. So instead, financing systems should reflect your own community. And it's really great to establish those or to start considering them and having those conversations before you actually need that financing system, right? Putting it in place now, we've seen this with some of the communities that we've worked with through Throwe Environmental and the SNEP network. Those communities that are more proactive are taking the steps that they need to now to put those financing systems in place, knowing that the biggest impacts of climate change are going to be in the near future. That also looks great for outside investors who are looking to invest money into climate smart solutions. And it gives communities the opportunity to leverage financing dollars as match when you are still using grants for funding in some sense. So a very quick overview of climate financing. We would encourage you to look at the many tools that are out there to support climate resilience planning and climate resilience financing. And one that we'll highlight today is one that we've developed at Throwe Environmental in partnership with the SNEP network. And it's called the Planning to Action Climate Toolkit. So this is an adaptation from the US Climate Toolkit. And it really just builds off of that existing tool to walk communities through the planning stages all the way through action and financing. There's a lot of questions to ask there, with all those different stages. So this is a nice streamlined approach to getting towards that last financing piece. And tools like these tend to be really attractive to funders, seeing that you've gone through all of the motions. Last thing to note is that this tool is still in development. So if there's interest, we definitely encourage you to reach out, but I will point you to the tutorial video to kind of give you a sample of what this tool will entail when it is ready for use. And you can look at that by just going on YouTube, searching Planning to Action Climate Toolkit, or by visiting the Throwe Environmental website or the SNEP Network's website. So with that, I will wrap it up. No more slides here, and I will pass it back over to Tess Clark to start facilitating our Q&A.
Thanks so much, Kyle and Joanne and Chris. I wanted to just take care of a quick housekeeping issue. A few of you asked about getting the slides, and like Martha mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, they will be made available to you. They will be posted on the SNEP Network website, which we will post in the chat, and is also www.snepnetwork.org. And before we launch into the Q&A, we have a few poll questions that we think will be helpful. And the reason we're launching these poll questions is because for folks with really project-specific questions, we'd love to follow up with you personally. So the first question, you can see that you can take them right in a row, but if you have an EJ-focused question, someone can follow up with you individually. We have your contact info. Anything about the actual tips, tricks, and best practices, let us know. And then finally, especially if you have any questions about the specific funding opportunities that were covered, including BRIC, the NCRF, the SRFs, we can follow up with you personally via email and save the Q&A for some broader questions that might apply to everyone in attendance today. So while you guys are filling this out, let's get right into it. The first question, Chris, if you don't mind taking a stab at this, if you could please tell us what is the SRF and what does it stand for and how do communities use it?
Sure. So the SRF is I'm sorry about all the acronyms. Sometimes you're so used to saying them that you forget that some people might not know what they mean. So the SRF stands for the State Revolving Loan Fund. or state revolving fund if you want to stick with SRF, but it's a loan, primarily a loan program. It's actually a grant from the US EPA to each individual state. So every state has an SRF program for both drinking water and clean water. Clean water is a euphemism for wastewater. And the states do differ in how they allocate that funding and how they set up those loans. Sometimes there are associated grant programs as well. There are also hardship eligibilities for communities with low income or emergency need. Sometimes there's principal forgiveness and other types of financial mechanisms that states use to distribute the funds. But in short, it's money that the EPA, US EPA gives to the states to allocate to communities for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. And the reason why it's called a revolving fund is because as communities pay it back, then that money can be turned around and go out the door again for funding other loans.
Great, thank you so much. The next question, I'd like both Chris and Joanne to respond. How can you best determine and then plan for the amount of time that's required for applying for a grant such as the one under BRIC? And Joanne, maybe you can offer your thoughts on this for BRIC and NFWF, and Chris, then you can tell us what kind of time commitment would be needed for an SRF process. Joanne?
Yeah, sure, Tess. So with an example like BRIC, and I've seen it happen just recently where you have departments within the same municipality who are really not talking to each other and coordinating with each other on what the application, what the proposal should look like. So the first thing I would do, and Kyle went through beautifully all the key components of that, I would organize within my municipality or organization, and I would find out where the interest is, and I would coordinate priorities within the municipality and then start planning now. Just have those conversations, because the work you do to prepare for something as big as BRIC would be, best laid plans that your time invested now, whether it's for BRIC or something else, are worthwhile. So conversations should start immediately. Chris?
I agree. I'll use just a kind of arbitrary, just say that there's a deadline, a grant application deadline of July 30th, 2022. Starting now is maybe even a little too late. You want to give yourself a lot of time. A lot of these projects, particularly construction projects, want feasibility studies which will have to be conducted, and sometimes preliminary engineering reports to show, well, hey, this is what we think we're going to do, and we think it can happen, because they don't want to allocate funding to a project that you come back 2 years later after you've bid it and designed it to find out that for some reason, physical geology or whatever, the project won't be able to go forward. So, and a lot of these funding programs have 45-day windows, and you're not going to be able to do all of this in 45 days. You often have to get what is it called? A resolution from your governing board to approve the application that's required with the application. And a lot of other things that you'll have to think about. So just adding a little more detail and in agreement with Joanne, I mean, it's never too early to start. And even if you end up not pursuing or getting awarded a certain grant that you had in mind, you can try again with that grant program in a subsequent year or a different funding mechanism. And I'll say, because someone pointed out to me in a direct message earlier, if this seems daunting and overwhelming, it kind of is, but there's also support out there. There's folks like the EFCs who provide technical assistance to communities. And then there's environmental consulting firms like Throwe Environmental and others I'm sure you're aware of, who will be more than happy to assist communities through their applications.
Yeah, and specifically on the NCRF, if people are in that eligible area and have questions, we are, as field liaisons, we're happy to follow up with you. And, taking advantage now of the time, as Chris said, don't wait until the announcement's out. That's too late. You should be thinking about things now and preparing partnerships and thinking about match and letting your state know and engaging your state and other entities about what your plans are. So never too late. Tess?
Great. Okay. So to summarize, we're looking at not just days, but weeks of work for most of these funding sources. So please plan accordingly. As a quick follow-up question, and then I'd like to hand it over to Kyle, who has a few questions that he received directly. And this is a good follow-up to this question, because often water skill issues, as you know, like protecting source water or dealing with flooding, don't follow municipal boundaries. What advice do you have for communities that do have concerns about the amount of time it takes to apply, or even about the management and administrative burden for these federal grants?
Yeah, I appreciate this question very much for who's ever sent it in, because you're speaking for probably everyone on this webinar. It takes time, sure, but this is how you're going to potentially move projects forward in your community. And the partnership aspect of this, in not taking everything on yourself, but putting a work group together, thinking through, who's taking on what, who's going to coordinate what activity, what information are you missing? So start doing that now. And as it comes to program management, that is a concern. And certainly funders want to know that once the award is made, you're going to be able to manage the process and the paperwork and all the admin and implementation. So thinking about that in advance, if you're not the right entity, then who might be that could support your project and add capacity to it that's a value added. This is all possible, and we don't want to make it sound like it's such a heavy lift. Actually, we're trying to do the opposite for you. We're trying to say, start thinking through a lot of these tips now, and working through it will get you just where you need to be. We've seen it happen over and over. The same communities who are organizing themselves are getting the money. And there's a reason, because they are thinking ahead and planning. So I'll get off my soapbox. Tess?
I'll just briefly add, and also using partners, relying on partners like consulting engineers, other municipalities, even your county and regional governments can assist in some of these, the development of some applications.
Perfect. Okay, so I'd like to hand it over to Kyle. Before I do, my colleague Leah is throwing out a survey link in our chat box. So folks, please take that and let us know how we did today, and any information you send we can use to improve in the future. All right, Kyle.
Perfect. Thanks, Tess. So yeah, I did just get a few direct messages here, so I want to address at least a couple of those. So one person asked, when you describe being a sub-applicant under the BRIC funding, does that mean that the state will select their preferred projects as a first step, and then you make it through their selection as a sub-applicant? Very good question. I think that can be one of the most challenging pieces of the whole eligibility area of BRIC. So as far as our research has shown, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily like a selection that you make it through. I think that makes it sound more programmatic and official than that actually is. However, I would say that each state will set its own priorities, and those should align with the larger BRIC program. So if a state's priorities differ a little bit, or maybe they focus in on maybe a certain area of BRIC's priorities, you would want to know that early, really as soon as you can, to start making sure that your project is tailored to that, or that you're picking the right project to move forward. So definitely something to consider. I also, or I guess I can open that up to Joanne and Chris. Anything else to add on that last one?
Great answer, Kyle.
Okay. And then I did get another question on Huck 8 watersheds and what those are. So Joanne went through those slides on the National Coastal Resilience Fund, and there was that map with kind of the orange outline of the US coast. So essentially that's just a watershed boundary that is applicable for the NCRF, but really you can think about NCRF as being open to any of those communities along the coast or the Great Lakes, the coast there, and then any of the territories and things like that. So Making sure that you're actually an eligible organization is something separate, and that should be done as well. But in terms of geographic eligibility, it's along the coast, and I would refer you back to the NCRF footprint, where you can actually put in your community's name or address to see if you're in one of those areas and if you're near one of the resilience hubs that NCRF likes to see.
Yeah, Kyle, can I just add that
Yeah, please.
we didn't have time to mention this, but within NFWF's website for NCRF, there is a CREST tool, right? So you can see where, you can go use that that map to see if you're in there, but you could also play around with it. It's an excellent tool. And you could put in your specific boundary of your potential project where you're thinking, and you could see the, how it rates in terms of community resilience, fish and wildlife impacts. And it's really wonderful, well done. And so I encourage, as people are thinking about that NCRF project, to go into the CREST tool. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I just put the link to the footprint map in the chat, and I'm going to look for the CREST tool link as well. So I'll drop that. But while I'll do that, I'll send it back to Tess.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. All right, a couple more questions, and we are approaching, we have a few more minutes left. So if you do have more questions, please get them in now, because we will follow up with you afterwards if we don't quite make it through all of them today. Joanne, can you explain again what you mean? So you've mentioned the transferability of a project can make it more competitive. How can some grant writers demonstrate that transferability in their proposal?
I really love these questions. So when you're thinking about transferability, so what you potentially are putting in as your project, is it something that others could learn from? Are there lessons that could be learned or information that could be gained that could be shared to even communities right outside your region or other states, or, that's what we mean by transferability. So I mentioned the idea of, small projects, pilot projects, demonstration projects. Maybe that's not as competitive as something you're going to learn all these lessons and really do something potentially creative and innovative that is going to be helping other communities. That's wonderful. And so that transferability makes a lot of sense for proposals to come in and think about that.
Perfect. Kyle, did you have anything to add? That was also related to your section.
I think Joanne covered it pretty well. Yeah, I think so.
All right, and there are a few more coming in. Okay, so Joanne, you mentioned that there would be questions about match, and we did get a couple. So one of those questions is related to how do you estimate or cost out when you have volunteers, how do you translate that into match? What's a good rule of thumb? And maybe you can also kind of describe what are some other good things to think about when you're finding match and when you're trying to calculate it.
Well, so I don't want to discourage anyone from applying for a grant because they can't find match. I mean, I know that it's so important to have the match, but you really do have to be creative. Many of the funding organizations understand that match is challenging, right? But almost every grant is, these days has a match of some level. And for volunteers, different federal agencies and nonprofits have how they quantify match, right? How dollar amount, or lumping in how many people they anticipate to attend. If you're engaging your partners within the state, can you ask them for potentially, is there other projects that you can use for match? People are afraid to call and reach out, and that's a bad move. You really should think through, that idea of a match. And And you could be in rooms, if you're getting rooms to hold meetings, things like webinar tools. You can think about so many different things that you might be already in using that you're not taking advantage of, and add it in as matched. What you don't want to do is say, we intend to apply. I mean, you certainly can say this, but we intend to apply for all of these grants. And how do you know it's going to come through, right? It's better to think through how that match can be. And this goes for any funding agency, right? Just go forward and talk to partners. Think through what is it going to take in part of your project, and then go to that agency and what do they quantify. If it's a volunteer, it might be one level. If it's a professional, it might be a completely different level. People miss those often. Kyle, did you have anything more to add on match?
Yeah, actually similar to match, but more so on cost effectiveness. I had another question that was kind of in the same ballpark. Someone asking, we highlighted disadvantaged communities for the BRIC program, but someone noted that like benefit cost analyses, those might explicitly, or by nature disadvantage those communities and maybe not let cost effectiveness come through as clearly. So I would say kind of what Joanne just said on match as well, like that even if a community isn't maybe optimized for cost effectiveness, or maybe your match isn't optimized, you can still move forward with your application. You can still reach out to the granting agency or to other partners to help strengthen that component. I definitely don't think that that's somewhere where if you don't maybe meet up to the threshold, or if you don't feel as strong on that component, that would mean you don't move forward with your application. I think
right. And then Kyle, we've often heard from communities that they work with engineering consulting firms who offer a little bit of match. I'm not putting anybody on the spot. I know that's very difficult in these times always to do that, but think about that, because if you're partnering potentially with a consulting firm, and there are many other federal grant programs that sometimes don't require that they can be used for a match. I think it's the NCRF. I'm sorry, the REPI funds, and maybe a couple USDA funds, and I don't have that specifically, but a few of the federal funds can be used as local match, not as federal.
Great. And also Martha Shields, the director of New England EFC, has something to add here. So Martha, go ahead.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to share something that I got in a private chat from a community that we're working with in Westport, Washington. It's from the Public Works Director there, Kevin Goodrich. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for joining us. And he writes that Westport applied for state assistance, a state level assistance, which is really capacity building, to do preliminary planning, engineering, and design work, and then took that work and used it to apply for BRIC funding, BRIC construction project funding, which is exactly it's a great example of what we talked about and the right way to do it. And I'm just, happy to give that as an example of really taking time to figure out how to effectively apply, hi Kevin, for these funds. So thank you, Kevin, for sharing that. And I'm happy to share that with the rest of the group. That's all I have. Do you have anything, Kevin, that you'd like to add?
Well, I was just going to say that the advanced assistance was actually pre-BRIC. So it was a FEMA program. And it was a pre-application vetted by the state emergency management, then forwarded to FEMA, awarded by FEMA, then back to state, who distributes the funds. So we use those funds, about $114,000, to do, like Martha said, the groundwork, and also to prepare an actual BRIC application. We're trying to build a tsunami vertical evacuation structure. And from what we learned, FEMA really likes it when you take FEMA money and build a project to ask for more FEMA money. So for those folks out there, I don't know how it works in every state, but Washington's process is a pre-application to state. State reviews the pre-app. If they like it, they send it back and say, okay, let's do a full application. Once they get in, and state helps you develop that. You have to have a team, obviously, but state will help you And then state then forwards it to FEMA for review. If FEMA likes it, comes back to state, all the details are worked out. So we're in final review now of our BRIC application from 2020 to build our vertical evacuation structure here in Westport, and very hopeful. And we actually just submitted a BRIC pre-app for another project that we're working with University of Washington folks on. So that's the Washington process. I don't know how it is everywhere, but I would imagine and there's some similarities. But anyway, thanks for having us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Tess.
That's a fantastic living example of the process we've tried to lay out today. And I'd like to rehash what Joanne said about talking to your hazard mitigation officer. Joanne and Kyle, maybe you can remind folks in a second how to best do that. But it is 2:27, so I'd like to pass it back over to Joanne for some closing thoughts and comments.
Yeah, and I think just to close that comment out, thinking about the person who is in charge of a particular program or region, please utilize them. Going in without that guidance, it's often difficult. So build that relationship. They want to hear details. They want to understand. So we encourage that. We're not used to having so many funding opportunities out there to choose from. And it is overwhelming right now to think through everything we've just gone through with COVID. And now potentially there are opportunities to move your community forward. It is overwhelming, but don't just take it one area at a time. Think through what your community needs to do to be more resilient, who's involved in that conversation, and really just don't be overwhelmed. There are so many wonderful opportunities ahead. And, we thought that perhaps this would clarify some of the confusion out there on what makes a good grant and what funders are thinking, and highlight a few grant opportunities for you. So hopefully we've done that. If you are an EJ community, you need some more guidance, we'd love to hear from you. If you want to know about NCRF or anything else, we do want to hear from you. And we're happy to follow up on any questions. I thank Martha again and her team at the New England Environmental Finance Center and Syracuse EFC. You guys are always awesome. So, thank you so much. And Kyle, you're just the best. I can't say any more than that. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.